The hallway light spilled across the bedroom floor in a thin, trembling line. She stood there frozen, one hand pressed lightly against the curve of her belly, the other gripping the doorframe so hard her knuckles had gone white. Inside, he sat on the edge of the bed, phone against his ear, his head tilted slightly, that casual, easy tilt he used when speaking to someone who made him smile. Someone who wasn't her. His voice was low, almost gentle. She couldn't hear the words, but it didn't matter. Words were no longer needed to understand the shape of betrayal. Her eyes, wide and dry, traced the familiar lines of his face, the face she used to know so well, now softened by laughter meant for someone else. The world around her blurred at the edges, but she kept staring, as if willing herself to memorize this moment, this exact moment when everything quietly broke. He didn't notice her at first, or maybe he did and just didn't care. When he finally glanced up, his eyes met hers without surprise, without guilt, only that cool, empty look people give to something they've already thrown away. He ended the call slowly, deliberately, as if even now he refused to rush for her sake. Setting the phone down, he rose, his movements sharp, final. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said, slipping his watch onto his wrist with a practiced ease. His tone was calm, almost bored. Not angry. Worse. Indifferent. She tried to speak, but her throat closed around the words. Her mouth opened, then closed again. Silence. Only her breathing, unsteady, uneven. He glanced toward the door, his body already half turned away. "I'm done, okay? The marriage, the baby, all of it. I have other plans now." He said it like discussing weather. Like she was a season that had simply ended. The bag was already packed. It sat near the dresser, half open, like it had been waiting for this moment too. He didn't hug her, didn't touch her, didn't even offer a last glance. The door clicked softly behind him. No slamming, no shouting, just that soft, cruel click. Final. She stayed where she was. The house seemed to breathe around her, the walls closing in and pulling away at the same time. Her hand slid slowly from the doorframe, hovering uncertainly in the empty air before falling to her side. Her eyes didn't blink. They stayed wide, stunned, drinking in the emptiness he left behind. Inside her, the baby shifted, a small, slow movement, as if asking if everything was still all right. She pressed her hand to her belly, gently, protectively, as a tear finally found its way down her cheek. But she didn't sob. She didn't collapse. She just stood there, silent, holding everything. The betrayal, the loneliness, the fragile heartbeat under her hand. All of it heavy and sacred. Outside the window, the world went on. Cars passed, a dog barked, a neon sign flickered down the block. But inside the house, time folded in on itself. She wasn't just abandoned. She was left standing at the edge of a life she no longer recognized, carrying the last piece of the future he had thrown away. And the silence, the terrible, hollow silence pressed closer around her, like a second skin she couldn't tear off. She packed slowly, not because there was much to take, but because every fold, every zip, every movement felt like peeling herself away from a life she had spent years building. The suitcase was old, one wheel jammed. She tugged it gently, afraid that even the sound of it scraping the floor might wake the ghosts that now lived in these walls. Her hand brushed against the edge of the crib tucked in the corner, empty. Still waiting. She let her fingers rest there for a moment longer, tracing the smooth wood, memorizing the promise it once held. No baby had slept there yet, but she had spent nights sitting beside it, imagining the weight of a tiny body swaddled in blankets. Now it felt like a question she no longer knew how to answer. The house was cold, too big. The echoes of laughter, of arguments, of shared life, they had all emptied out overnight, leaving just the bare bones behind. It smelled faintly of coffee and old wood and something else. Something she couldn't name, like the last breath before a storm. She slipped on her coat, the one that barely fit over her round belly, tugged it close, though it couldn't quite button all the way. The keys to the house glinted in her palm. Small, sharp, almost accusing. She thought about leaving them on the table, but in the end she tucked them into her pocket and said nothing to the empty room. Dragging the suitcase behind her, she stepped out into the night. The door closed with a soft snick. No ceremony, no goodbyes. The street was damp from an earlier rain, the pavement glistening under the harsh yellow streetlights. She stood there for a moment, adjusting to the air, the space, the absence of walls around her. Cars passed by, their drivers not noticing the woman with the worn suitcase and the too thin coat. Nobody noticed. The world spun on, indifferent. She started walking, one step, another. The suitcase bumped and rattled behind her. She tightened her grip on the handle, ignored the ache already creeping into her fingers. The night pressed against her, cool and quiet, carrying the scent of wet asphalt and something almost sweet, maybe the last bloom of late autumn flowers hidden in someone's yard. Her shoes soaked through at the toes. She didn't know where she was going. There were no family members to call, no friends she could lean on. Most had slipped away years ago, slowly at first, then all at once, when life had demanded too much, when love had asked for patience they couldn't give. Now it was just her. Her and the little life fluttering quietly under her ribs. She stopped under a flickering street lamp. The light buzzed and spat overhead. She looked up, blinking against its sharpness. For a second, just one, she closed her eyes. The kind of stillness that hurt settled into her bones, the deep, aching kind that makes the world tilt and sway. When she opened her eyes again, nothing had changed. The street was still empty, the night still cold. But she adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder, tightened her hand on the suitcase handle, and kept walking. She had no map, no plan, only the quiet, stubborn promise to the child she carried. We will find a way. Somehow we will. And under the heavy sky, she disappeared into the night, small, tired, but still moving. The motel stood at the edge of the city, its neon sign buzzing faintly, a few letters missing like broken teeth. Vac NCY, it read, the absence somehow louder than the word itself. She hesitated at the doorway. The paint peeled from the wood. A single bulb swung in the wind above her head, casting her shadow long and thin across the concrete. Inside, the man at the desk barely looked up. He slid a worn key across the counter without speaking, his fingers stained with ink and old cigarette smoke. Room 12. She climbed the narrow stairs slowly, each step groaning under her weight. Her hand rested over her belly, not protectively, not nervously, but as if reminding herself, still here, still breathing. The hallway smelled of damp carpet and something sharp, like old bleach that never really cleaned anything. When she unlocked the door, it creaked open to reveal a room too small, too tired. One window, sealed shut. One bed, thin and sagging in the middle. A faded curtain fluttered slightly even though the window never opened. She dragged the suitcase inside, set it down with a soft thud, and closed the door. For a long while she just stood there. The silence wasn't comforting. It was the kind that pressed in, filling every corner, thick and heavy. She lowered herself onto the bed carefully, easing down the weight of her body, the weight of everything she carried. The mattress dipped under her. Springs creaked. She sat still, hands loose in her lap, staring at the blank wall across from her as if it might offer answers. The baby kicked. Just once, a small, impatient nudge, and she exhaled, a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She pulled a plastic bag from her suitcase, a sandwich, 2 bruised apples, a small bottle of water. She ate slowly, chewing without tasting, rationing without planning. Every bite was a choice between now and tomorrow. When the food was gone, she leaned back, one hand resting again on her stomach, feeling the faint rhythm inside her. The air in the room was too still. She could hear the faint hum of the city through the thin walls, cars passing, distant music, someone's angry voice swallowed by the night. She curled onto her side, careful not to press too hard against the tightness of her belly. The bed was cold against her skin, the blanket thin and scratchy. She closed her eyes, but sleep didn't come easy. It never does when fear curls up beside you. Tonight, she whispered nothing into the darkness. Not prayers, not curses. Not even hope. Just breath. In and out. Slow, quiet, heavy. The baby shifted again, a small, stubborn reminder of life. She opened her eyes to the cracked ceiling above, tracing invisible shapes in the stains and peeling paint. And in that small, forgotten room, under the flickering shadows of the neon sign, she made a silent vow, not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet promise. We will not stay here forever. We will find our way out. The pain started quietly, a slow, dull ache low in her back, so faint she thought maybe it was just another restless night. She shifted on the mattress, tried to find a softer spot on the bed, but the springs pushed against her like stubborn fists. Then it came again, sharper this time, folding her in half before she could catch her breath. She sat up, slowly, hand pressed against the bed to steady herself. Her other hand gripped her belly, fingers spread wide, feeling the tightness ripple through her. It was time. Too soon, too fast. A wave of panic rose in her chest, hot and wild, but she forced it down. She couldn't afford fear now, not now. She slid off the bed, her knees trembling as they hit the floor. The thin carpet scratched her palms as she pushed herself up. The room spun. She waited until it steadied. With shaking hands, she grabbed her coat, the one that no longer closed over her belly. She slipped her feet into worn shoes and reached for the door. The hallway was empty. Silent. She shuffled toward the stairs, one hand braced on the wall, the other clutching the curve of her belly. Each step down sent a jolt of pain shooting up her spine, but she bit her lip and kept moving. Outside, the air was damp and cold. The city smelled of rain-soaked asphalt and exhaust fumes. The streetlights threw long pools of yellow light across the cracked sidewalks. She stood there for a moment under one of them, breathing hard, her face pale, slick with sweat. Her hair clung to her forehead, the strands heavy with the weight of the night. A car passed by, a blur of headlights and the faint thrum of music. She lifted a hand, tried to wave, but it sped past, swallowed by the darkness. Another contraction hit, harder now. She bent forward, gripping her knees, her breath coming in sharp, broken gasps. Tears filled her eyes, not from fear, not even from pain, but from the sheer loneliness of it all. No one to call, no hand to hold, no voice to tell her she was doing fine. She straightened slowly, wiping her face with the sleeve of her coat, and took a step forward, and then another. The city was a blur around her. Neon signs, shuttered windows, empty streets. She walked, the suitcase left behind, nothing in her hands now but herself, and the life she was about to bring into the world. She passed a darkened bus stop, an old man asleep on the bench. She kept walking. A woman in a bright dress leaned against a doorway, smoking. Their eyes met for a moment, a flash of understanding, but neither spoke. The hospital wasn't close. She didn't know if she would make it. Another contraction gripped her body, fierce and unrelenting. She stumbled, caught herself against a lamppost, her breath sharp and thin. Her knees buckled, but she fought to stay standing. A taxi, yellow and bright, turned the corner ahead. She lifted both hands this time, waving them wildly, tears blurring her vision. The car slowed, a small mercy. She climbed in, one hand clutching her belly, the other bracing against the seat. "The hospital," she rasped. The driver glanced at her through the rearview mirror, eyes wide, nervous, and nodded. As the car sped toward the hospital, she leaned her head back, closed her eyes, and whispered into the darkness, "Hold on, little one. We're almost there." Outside the window, the city lights blurred into long streaks of gold and red, a quiet storm she was leaving behind, one breath at a time. The hospital walls were too white. Not the comforting kind, but the kind that made the world feel sterile, distant, not meant for someone like her. Fluorescent lights buzzed above her as she was wheeled through the corridor, their glow sharp and unkind against the hollows of her face. Her coat slipped from her shoulders somewhere along the way, but she didn't have the strength to ask for it back. She kept her hand pressed over her belly. Even as the nurses spoke over her head, their voices clipped and professional. "She's early," one said. "No prenatal records?" Another whispered. A pause, a frown, uninsured, as if the word itself was a judgment. She heard it all but didn't flinch. There wasn't room inside her for shame, not tonight. Only a hollow ache where fear used to live. The labor came fast and hard, like a storm rolling in without warning. She gripped the sides of the hospital bed, the metal cold under her fingers, the pain white-hot and endless. No hand held hers, no voice whispered comfort, just the beep of machines and the clinical murmur of people who didn't know her name, only her case. When it was over, they placed the tiny swaddled body on her chest. A boy, warm, breathing, real. She stared at him, her fingers trembling as she traced the curve of his cheek. His eyes were closed, his mouth a small, perfect bow. He made a soft sound, half a sigh, half a yawn, and nestled closer to her. Tears finally came then, hot and unstoppable, slipping down her cheeks and into the blanket that smelled of detergent and something faintly sweet. She didn't cry loudly, she didn't sob. The tears were quiet, heavy, falling from a place so deep inside her she hadn't even known it was there. For the first time in a long time, she let herself feel everything. The loneliness, the betrayal, the fear, but also the fierce, aching love that tightened around her chest like a fist. They let her hold him for a few hours. Maybe because the ward was busy. Maybe because no one was paying close attention to the woman in the corner room. When they came to take him for his first checkup, she hesitated, her arms tightening around him for just a second longer. But she let go. She always knew how to let go. By morning, a nurse with tired eyes and a clipboard stood by her bed. "You'll be discharged today," she said, not unkindly but not warmly either. "You can't stay. No place to go. No home. No family waiting outside with balloons or flowers. Just her, a plastic hospital bracelet cutting into her wrist and a newborn swaddled too tightly in a too big blanket." She dressed slowly, every movement stiff, the world around her sharp and too bright. She bundled her son against her chest, his body feather-light but heavier than anything she had ever carried. Out in the parking lot, the sky was a hard, washed-out blue. She stepped onto the cracked sidewalk, the hospital's automatic doors sliding closed behind her with a sigh. There were no taxis waiting, no one watching for her. Just the cold bite of morning air and the long stretch of concrete leading to nowhere. She shifted the weight of the baby in her arms, pulling the thin blanket tighter around him. Her breath clouded in front of her face. She looked down at him, his face peaceful, unaware, and whispered, not for the world to hear but for him alone. "I have you, and you have me. That's enough. We'll make it enough." The wind tugged at the edges of her coat as she started walking, one slow step at a time, into the day that didn't care she had nowhere to go. But she cared, and that would have to be enough for now. The sidewalk stretched in front of her like a question with no answer. She walked slowly, her body sore, the baby pressed tight against her chest, his small breaths warming the thin fabric between them. Each step felt heavier than the last. The city moved around her, fast, loud, indifferent. People passed by without seeing her, just another figure lost in the noise. Her feet ached. The worn soles of her shoes slapped against the pavement, gathering the dust of a morning that had no welcome for her. She paused at the corner of a busy street, the wind pushing against her, slicing through the thinness of her coat. Across the road stood a small diner, old, with chipped red paint and a crooked, open sign swinging in the breeze. The windows were fogged from the heat inside, blurred shapes moving in the warmth. For a moment she stood there just watching, the way a starving person might stare at a full table they know they cannot touch. The baby stirred, a soft whimper against her chest. She rocked gently, instinctively, but it wasn't enough. He was hungry. She was too, but she had long learned how to ignore it. She tightened her grip on him and crossed the street. Inside, the diner was small and worn but alive with the clatter of plates and the low hum of voices. The smell hit her first: bacon, coffee, bread, warm and rich and unbearable. She hovered just inside the door, uncertain. Heads turned briefly, but looked away just as fast. Except one. Behind the counter stood a woman, older, with silver streaks running through her hair, an apron tied neatly around her waist. Her hands were busy wiping down the counter, but her eyes, sharp, steady, stayed on the girl by the door. Not judgmental, not curious, just seeing her, really seeing her. The girl shifted on her feet, her voice caught somewhere behind her ribs. Before she could speak, before she could even think of what to say, the woman beckoned her forward with a small nod, like an invitation given without conditions. "Sit," the woman said, voice low, no fuss. She pointed to a booth in the corner. The girl moved as if pulled by a string, sliding into the cracked vinyl seat. The baby fussed, a weak cry escaping his small mouth, and she rocked him gently, whispering soft, broken nothings. A few minutes later, the woman placed a plate of scrambled eggs and toast in front of her. A glass of water. No menu, no questions. The girl stared at it, the steam rising in delicate curls, and for a moment she just sat there, too tired, too raw to move. "Eat," the woman said simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. She picked up the fork with shaking fingers and took a bite. The food was plain but warm, and it filled a hollow space in her she hadn't realized was so wide, so deep. The baby quieted, as if sensing the change in her. When the plate was empty, the girl looked up, her eyes meeting the woman's again. "I don't have any money," she said quietly. the words thick and heavy in her mouth. The woman wiped her hands on a towel, set it down, and leaned her elbows on the counter. "I didn't ask for any," she said. "But if you're willing to work, wash dishes, clean tables, I could use an extra pair of hands." The girl blinked, unsure if she had heard right. "You and the baby can stay in the back room for now," the woman added, her voice still calm. "It's not much, but it's warm. Safe." The girl's fingers tightened around the baby's blanket. She felt something stir inside her. Not trust, not yet, but something close to it. A small, flickering thing. Hope. She nodded, too tired to find the right words. The woman only smiled, a soft, knowing smile. "Good?" she said. "We'll start tomorrow." The baby sighed against her chest, his tiny body finally relaxing. For the first time in a long time, the girl let herself breathe. Really breathe. The diner hummed around her, plates clinking, coffee being poured, laughter rising and falling, and she sat there in the corner booth, invisible to most, but not to everyone. Not anymore. Morning came early in the diner. Before the city even stirred, she was already on her feet, moving quietly through the kitchen, careful not to wake the baby sleeping in a cardboard box lined with old towels in the storeroom, the softest nest she could make for him. She tied the borrowed apron around her waist, the fabric stiff and stained with years of work. The strings barely circled her, loose against her still healing frame. No one needed to tell her what to do. She had seen enough kitchens, enough long shifts. She understood the unspoken rules. Move fast, stay quiet, get it done. She washed dishes until her knuckles went raw, hands plunged into hot water, the sting a reminder that she was still here, still moving. She wiped tables, scrubbed the floor, took out the trash, her steps steady but heavy. No complaints, no questions, just work. The other waitresses mostly ignored her. A glance here and there, a shrug. They had seen girls like her before, or thought they had. But the owner, the woman with silver in her hair, watched with quiet eyes. She didn't offer praise, but sometimes, when the girl's hands shook from exhaustion, a fresh cup of coffee would appear on the counter without a word. Between shifts, she nursed the baby in the back room, sitting on a stack of old crates, the sound of clattering dishes and distant laughter bleeding through the thin walls. She whispered to him, words she barely remembered forming. One day, you'll have more." She wrapped him tight, sang to him softly in a cracked voice, songs her own mother used to hum when she was small, songs she hadn't realized she still carried somewhere deep inside her. The pay was small, barely enough. A few wrinkled bills slipped into her hand at the end of the week. She folded them carefully, tucked them into her shoe, the safest place she could think of. Each night, when the diner closed, she cleaned until the floor shined, her reflection faint and ghost-like in the cracked tiles. She ate whatever scraps were left, never asking for more. She wore the same clothes day after day, washing them in the sink at night, hanging them over the heater to dry. And when the lights went out and the world outside fell quiet, she curled up on the floor beside the box where her son slept, her hand resting lightly on the curve of his tiny back, feeling the rise and fall of his breath. She would stare at the ceiling, the cracked plaster forming strange shapes, and imagine a different life. Not grand, not rich, just a room of their own. A bed with sheets that smelled of sun, a window that opened to fresh air, mornings without fear. No one saw the battle she fought each day. No medals, no applause. Just a girl with tired eyes and a stubborn heart, pushing forward one slow step at a time. But in the stillness of those nights when the world wasn't watching, she planted her hope like a seed buried deep in winter soil. Waiting, believing, even if only in a small, cracked corner of her heart, that spring would come. It was late afternoon, the kind of time when the sun dipped low and spilled through the diner windows in long, dusty streaks. She was wiping down the counter. The same motion she had done 1,000 times by now, when the bell over the door chimed softly. A man stepped inside, older, neatly dressed in a way that looked effortless. He wore a gray suit, not new but well cared for, and carried a leather briefcase scuffed at the corners. He slid into a booth without a fuss, set the briefcase beside him, and opened a worn notebook. His fingers moved quickly across the pages, pausing now and then, tapping a pen against the wood of the table. She brought him coffee without being asked. Black, steaming, just how most men his age seemed to like it. He looked up as she set the cup down. Their eyes met for a moment and he gave her a nod. Not rushed, not distracted. A real nod. A thank you. She nodded back and turned away, wiping the counter again, wiping and wiping as if scrubbing the weariness from her hands. The diner wasn't busy that time of day. A few regulars sat hunched over their late lunches. The owner was in the back, counting the register. The baby slept in the storeroom, bundled in blankets that barely kept out the chill. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. When she brought his check, the man looked at her not with pity. She would have hated that, but with something sharper, more curious. "You work hard," he said, voice low, not judging. She shrugged, the kind of shrug that hides everything and nothing. He paused, then reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card. It was simple, white, thick, the letters crisp and neat. "Local program," he said. "Helps single mothers. Business skills, finance basics, small grants. It's nothing fancy, but it's a start." She stared at the card in his hand but didn't take it, not right away. Trust was a slow thing for her now. Careful. Worn thin at the edges, he didn't push. Just set the card on the table and slid it toward her with 2 fingers. "Think about it," he said, gathering his notebook and briefcase. When he stood, he left a few bills tucked under his coffee cup. More than enough for the meal. Enough to cover 2 meals, maybe 3. He gave her one last look, steady, respectful, then walked out into the cooling evening. She stood there a long while after he left, staring at the card as if it might disappear if she blinked. The card was light in her hand, but it felt heavy with possibility. The kind of weight she hadn't carried in a long, long time. In the back room, the baby stirred, a small whimper curling into the quiet. She tucked the card into her pocket, feeling the edges press against her thigh, real, solid. It wasn't a promise, it wasn't a guarantee, but it was something she hadn't held in her hand in a long time. A choice. A door cracked open, and standing there under the fading light of the diner, she realized, sometimes the first step doesn't look like a miracle. Sometimes it's just a card on a table, waiting for you to be brave enough to pick it up. At night, after the diner closed and the baby was asleep, she sat by the small storeroom window, the only one that wasn't painted shut, and turned the card over and over in her fingers. The city hummed softly outside, distant and far away from her small world. She read the words again. Business training program for single mothers. Free. Simple. Unfancy. Almost unbelievable. She folded it carefully, slipped it into the front pocket of her apron, and sat back, staring out at the narrow slice of sky she could see. The stars were faint against the glow of the city, but they were there. Stubborn, steady. The next morning, she stood outside the community center where the classes were held. The baby bundled against her chest in the old carrier she had stitched together from worn cloth and threadbare scarves. She hesitated on the steps, adjusting the strap digging into her shoulder. Doubts buzzed in her head, louder than the traffic passing behind her. "You're too tired. You're too late. You'll never catch up." But then she looked down at him, his tiny face peaceful against her chest, and she tightened her grip on the strap. No, not today. Inside, the classroom smelled faintly of chalk and old paper. A handful of women sat at plastic tables, worn notebooks open in front of them. Some had toddlers crawling under their chairs. Some sat alone, like her, clutching pens in nervous fingers. She slid into a seat at the back, careful not to make noise. The baby shifted, soft and warm against her. The instructor, a woman with kind, firm eyes, handed her a booklet. "Welcome," she said, not smiling, not pitying, just offering the word like a rope across deep water. The lessons were simple at first. How to balance a budget, how to write a basic business plan, how to believe that you are worth investing in. The girl scribbled notes in the margins of the booklet, her handwriting small and careful. She stayed late after the others left, rereading everything, afraid to miss even a single word. Between shifts at the diner and sleepless nights, she studied. By the light of the diner's kitchen when no one was looking. By the dusty lamplight in the storeroom while the baby slept curled against her side. Dreams she had buried began to stir again. Not loud, not boastful, just a quiet murmur in her chest. A place of my own. A small cafe. Warm bread. Fresh coffee. A place where people linger, where they feel safe. Not a palace, not a fortune. Just enough. Enough to breathe. Enough to stop surviving and start living. She sketched ideas in a battered notebook. Menus, layouts, names scratched out and rewritten. She made lists, secondhand furniture, used appliances, the cost of paint, the price of flour. Every time doubt crept in, she looked at the baby's face, round and soft and trusting, and she would whisper, "For you." Weeks passed. Then months, slow, hard, hungry months. But for the first time in her life, hunger wasn't the only thing filling her. Hope lived there too now. Small, stubborn, impossible hope, sprouting between the cracks like wildflowers in broken concrete. The community hall smelled faintly of dust and coffee, a smell that reminded her of second chances and old wood floors. Rows of metal chairs lined the room, some half filled with people shifting, whispering, papers clutched in their hands. On the far side stood a long table where 3 judges sat, a woman with wire-rimmed glasses, a man in a sharp suit, and another with a kind face and ink-stained fingers. A microphone rested at the center of the room, too tall, too cold, under a single humming light. She stood in the back, her fingers buried deep in the fabric of the baby carrier, feeling the soft weight of him sleeping against her chest. His breath was slow, steady, grounding her in a world that felt too big, too sharp. They were calling names one by one. Some walked up strong, papers rustling in practiced hands. Others stumbled through nervous words, voices shaking under the weight of being seen. When they called her name, she almost didn't hear it. It floated over the noise in the room, simple and strange. For a second, her legs refused to move. Fear gripped her ankles like cold hands. "You don't belong here. You're a girl from nowhere, with nothing." But she felt the baby shift slightly, a small reminder, and she inhaled, slow and deep, her ribs aching with the effort. One step, then another. The floorboards creaked under her weight as she crossed the room. Every eye seemed to follow her, but she kept her gaze steady on the microphone. When she reached it, she adjusted it lower, the metal cold against her fingertips. The room fell quiet. She could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, loud, fast, uneven. She didn't have glossy papers. She didn't have slideshows or polished speeches. She had only her voice. She swallowed once, twice, and then began. "My name is Lena," she said, her voice soft but clear, carrying across the silence. "I want to open a small cafe." She paused, feeling the weight of the moment settle around her. "Not a big place," she continued. "Just somewhere warm, somewhere people can sit when they have nowhere else to go. Good coffee, fresh bread, a place that feels like home even if you don't have one." Her hands tightened on the baby carrier as she spoke, feeling the strength she wasn't sure she still had. "I know it's small," she said, glancing down once, gathering herself, "but I believe small things matter." Another breath. "I have a business plan. It's not perfect, but I have experience and I have reasons to fight for it." She said it without flinching, no apology in her voice, just truth. Silence hung for a moment after she finished, not empty, not cold, full, heavy. The woman with glasses scribbled something on her pad. The man in the suit leaned back, considering. But the man with the ink-stained fingers, he smiled, just slightly, and he nodded. It was small, a crack in a wall too high to climb. But sometimes a crack is all you need. She stepped back from the microphone, her hands still steady, her chest still rising and falling beneath the soft weight of her child. As she turned and walked back to her seat, the world felt different. Not easier, not softer, but possible. And for the first time in a long, long time, that was enough. The phone call came 3 days later. She was in the storeroom, kneeling on the floor, folding freshly washed baby clothes. Tiny onesies, threadbare but clean, their edges curling with age. The baby gurgled softly beside her, batting at the loose hem of her apron with clumsy fists. The phone on the counter buzzed once, then again. She wiped her hands on her jeans and crossed the small room, heart thudding louder with each step. She almost didn't answer. Good news had never come from phones before. But something, some stubborn piece of her, reached out. "Hello?" A pause. "Paper shuffling on the other end?" "Lena Monroe?" She swallowed. "Yes. This is Samuel from the Small Business Foundation." His voice was calm, measured. "I'm calling about your application." She pressed the phone tighter to her ear, the cord twisting in her fingers. "We reviewed your proposal," he continued, each word slow, deliberate. "We'd like to offer you a microloan to start your cafe." For a moment the room tilted, not badly, but like a boat catching a sudden shift in the tide. A loan, not a gift, not charity, a chance. "It's not much," Samuel said, as if sensing her hesitation. Enough to get you a small space, some equipment, a start. A start. She blinked, her eyes burning hot. She turned slightly so the baby wouldn't see her face. "Thank you," she whispered, the words foreign in her mouth. "Thank you." "There will be conditions," he added gently. "It'll be hard, but we believe you can do it." Hard she could handle. Hard she knew. Hard was the language her bones were built on. When she hung up the phone, she stood there for a long time, staring at the peeling wallpaper, the cracked sink, the little boy now giggling at a speck of dust floating in the sunlight. Her legs felt weak. Her hands shook. Not from fear this time, from something wilder, stronger, hope, real and tangible, sitting in her chest like a heartbeat she thought she had lost. She picked up her son and held him high, his small body wiggling against her. He laughed, a sharp, clear sound that split the dusty light. "We're going to build something, you and me," she said, her voice soft but certain. Outside the grimy window, the world went on. Cars rushing, people moving, but inside the storeroom, a door had opened. Not wide, not easy, but enough. And sometimes, enough is all it takes to change everything. The cafe wasn't much to look at. A narrow, forgotten space tucked between a laundromat and a closed bookstore. The windows were cloudy, the walls scarred with old paint, and the floorboards creaked under her cautious steps. But it was hers. She stood in the center of the empty room, a set of heavy keys dangling from her fingers. The afternoon sun spilled through the front window in long golden beams, cutting through the dust that hung lazily in the air. Her son, now almost crawling, sat on a faded blanket in the corner, gurgling at nothing in particular. She watched him for a long moment before kneeling down, letting the keys rest on the floor beside her. She ran her hand over the wood, rough, cracked, but solid. Like her. For weeks after that, she worked. She scraped old paint from the walls, her hands blistering against the roughness. She sanded down the counters, mended the broken chairs she found at thrift stores, and stitched curtains out of old linen bought in bulk. When she couldn't afford new plates, she bought mismatched ones, each with different patterns, different histories, and stacked them proudly on the shelves she built herself. At night, after putting her son to sleep in the little crib she set up behind the counter, she would sit at one of the tables with a notebook, sketching out simple menus: coffee, fresh bread, pastries made with whatever ingredients she could afford that week. There were days when exhaustion clung to her skin like a second coat, days when the doubts came creeping in. Soft, persistent voices whispering, "You're not enough. You'll fail." But then she would look at her son. Sleeping, breathing, living proof that she had already survived the worst. The day of the opening came quietly, without fanfare. No ribbon cutting, no grand speeches, just a hand-painted sign in the window. Open. The first customer was a young woman with tired eyes and a fraying coat. She ordered a coffee and a slice of warm bread. The woman sat by the window, wrapping her hands around the chipped ceramic mug like it was something precious. Lena stood behind the counter, wiping it down even though it was already clean, heart racing, hands steady. More people came, slowly, shyly at first. A mother with 2 children, a retired teacher with a stack of books, a man in work boots who nodded once before settling into a corner seat. The cafe filled with the soft hum of voices, the clink of spoons against ceramic, the scent of fresh bread rising into the air. Lena moved among them, her steps quiet but sure, her apron tied neatly around her waist, the baby asleep in a bassinet behind the counter, his small chest rising and falling with each breath. She smiled, not a wide, showy smile, but a quiet one, the kind that comes from a place deeper than happiness. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floor. Outside, the city kept rushing past, fast, impatient, endless. But inside the little cafe, time slowed. It wasn't grand, it wasn't perfect, but it was warm, and it was hers. And for the first time in a long, long time, she wasn't surviving, she was living. The days blurred into weeks. The little cafe, once an empty shell, began to hum with life. Morning after morning, she flipped the sign from closed to open, set fresh flowers in chipped glass jars on each table, and kneaded bread dough until her arms ached and her fingers cramped. Word traveled slowly, not in grand headlines, but in whispers between neighbors, in the warmth passed from one hand to another over a hot cup of coffee. They came, not because it was the fanciest place or the newest, but because it felt like stepping into someone's home. A place where the coffee was always hot, the bread always fresh, and the woman behind the counter always had a soft nod or a quiet smile that said, "You matter here." Sometimes, she caught people lingering at the tables long after their cups were empty. An old man reading the same newspaper 3 times over, a young woman writing letters by hand, a boy with scuffed sneakers sketching in a worn notebook. They stayed because there was something rare in the air, something that didn't cost extra, something she had built without even meaning to. Hope. The media found her story by accident. One afternoon, a young journalist from a small local paper came in, ordered a coffee, and asked about the place, about her. She didn't know what made her answer. Maybe it was the kindness in the woman's eyes, the way she listened without interrupting. Lena told her about the night spent walking with nowhere to go, about the diner, the classes, the dream that started on a piece of scrap paper under a flickering street lamp. The article came out a week later. From homeless to cafe owner, how one single mother built a new life. Simple, honest, no gloss, just her truth laid bare. At first, she didn't think anyone would care. But they did. More people came, some just to sit, some to shake her hand, some to look around and see if the magic was real. A woman from a larger newspaper called. Then a small television crew came, setting up cameras awkwardly in the narrow space, asking her questions she still found hard to answer. "What kept you going?" they asked. She glanced at her son, now wobbling across the floor in wide, unsteady steps, a grin splitting his face. "I didn't have the luxury of giving up," she said softly. The cameras clicked. The lights blinked. But inside, she stayed steady, grounded in the quiet truth that had carried her here. Breath by breath, step by step. Success didn't come with fireworks or flashing lights. It came like morning sunlight creeping over a windowsill, slow and certain, warming everything it touched. She still scrubbed floors after the cafe closed, still counted pennies carefully, still woke up in the middle of the night when her son cried out. But now, when she looked around, she saw more than chipped tables and mismatched plates. She saw a life she had built with her own 2 hands, and every cup poured, every loaf of bread pulled from the oven, every quiet smile across a cracked counter. They all whispered the same thing back to her. "You are not broken. You never were." It was late autumn when the invitation came. A simple, cream-colored envelope tucked between bills and ads in the mailbox outside the cafe. She almost threw it away without opening it. But something, curiosity, maybe, made her tear it open, careful, as if the paper might sting. Inside, an invitation to a local gala, celebrating small business owners who had overcome hardship. She stared at it for a long time, the paper trembling slightly in her hand. For years, she had stayed quiet, small, out of sight. But something inside her shifted. She smoothed the invitation flat and set it carefully on the counter. A few weeks later, she stood at the edge of a grand hall, the lights soft and golden, the sound of laughter and clinking glasses filling the air. She wore a simple dress, navy blue borrowed, and her hair was pinned back in a neat twist. No glitter, no flash, just quiet dignity. Her son, now toddling proudly beside her in a tiny suit that didn't quite fit, clutched her hand tightly. The room was full of polished people, shining shoes, expensive perfume, smiles that didn't always reach the eyes. She almost didn't see him. But the past has a way of finding you, even in the brightest rooms. He was standing near the bar, a glass in hand, laughing a little too loudly, his tie loosened, the shine of wealth dulled around the edges. Older, thinner, tired in a way that expensive suits couldn't hide. Their eyes met. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to just the space between them. Recognition flickered across his face. Confusion first, then something sharper. Regret? Shame? She couldn't tell. He set his glass down slowly, straightened his jacket as if trying to gather what was left of himself. She didn't move, didn't blink. She felt her son tug her hand, and she knelt, fixing his jacket, brushing a stray curl from his forehead. When she stood again, her ex-husband was still watching, frozen, waiting. She smiled. Small, calm, the kind of smile that doesn't come from spite or anger, but from a place he could no longer touch. Without a word, she turned away, her son's hand warm in hers, and walked toward the front of the room. She didn't need an apology. She didn't need him to see her success. She had already won. Not by becoming what he had left her for, but by becoming someone even she had once been too afraid to imagine. As they crossed the floor, her son looked up at her, his face open, trusting. "Mommy," he said, voice clear and bright, "are we going home now?" She squeezed his hand gently. "Yes, baby," she said, "we're already home." And together, under the chandeliers and watchful eyes, they walked out, not away from the past but through it, unbothered, unshaken, free. The cafe opened early the next morning, the way it always did, before the streets filled, before the city stretched awake. She stood by the front window, the first rays of sunlight slipping in, gold and quiet, painting long, lazy lines across the worn wooden floor. Her son sat at the counter on a tall stool, legs swinging, a crayon clutched in his fist as he filled a scrap of paper with crooked, colorful shapes. He hummed softly to himself, a sound she had come to know better than any song. She watched him, her heart full but calm, like the slow, steady tide pulling back from shore. The bell over the door chimed softly. A man stepped inside, not a regular. His coat was too sharp, his shoes too clean. He looked around, lingering longer than most at the walls, the tables, the faces. He met her eyes, and something flickered there. Interest, calculation, something not easily named. She wiped her hands on her apron and crossed the room, her steps sure, unhurried. "Coffee?" she offered, voice warm but cautious. He smiled, not wide, not rushed. "I'm looking for the owner," he said. "You found her," she replied simply. He hesitated, then reached into his coat, pulling out a card, clean, thick, heavy with the quiet weight of opportunity. She didn't reach for it yet. The world around her felt still, balanced on the edge of something unseen. The man waited, patient. She looked back at her son, who glanced up, smiled, and waved his crayon in the air like a flag. She smiled too, small, steady, and turned back to the man. "What's this about?" she asked. He placed the card gently on the counter. "A business proposal," he said. "Something bigger." The sun climbed higher outside, spilling more light across the tables, the cracked plates, the faded walls she had once mended with her own two hands. She picked up the card, feeling its weight. No promises, no guarantees, just a door, not yet open, but waiting. She slipped the card into her pocket, her hand brushing against it, feeling the edges press firm and real against her. "Maybe," she said, her voice soft but sure. "Maybe." And behind her the cafe hummed, small and stubborn and alive as the day began. To be continued.